Hey, writers! I am so happy to introduce you all to Erin Halden. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you, Sarah. Nice to see you.
It's always good to see you. And writers, we are going to talk about a hot topic today. It's not controversial, I promise, but it is really important for the stories that you're writing. But before we do, let me introduce you to Erin because she is awesome and amazing at the things that she does here. And I want to introduce you a little bit better. Erin is a writer, developmental editor, and a certified book coach who helps writers dig into the emotional heart of their stories to solve the problems that are stopping them from getting to the end. She has a deep love of literature for young people of all genres, characters who are on a who am I journey, and stories that end on a note of hope. A former television producer and scriptwriter, which is pretty cool, I'm just going to say. She has published more than a dozen short stories and holds an MFA in writing for young people. When she's not thinking about, talking about, tinkering with, or fixing stories, she can be found in her attic writing more stories.
Yes.
So you are well enveloped in the world of story.
Yes, I am. And have been for a long time.
Yeah, yeah, very good. So I've asked Erin to come chat with us here a bit today because Erin has this really interesting outlook on the topic of antagonism, which is really important for our middle grade and our YA novels, really for any story, but today we're going to specifically focus on middle grade and YA. And so maybe just because I want to make sure that everybody's on equal playing field here for some of these terms that tend to get thrown around in the writing world. Can you tell us what you mean specifically by antagonism and antagonist? What are we talking about?
Yeah. So antagonism is kind of, you can think of it like an umbrella term for anything, and I mean anything that gets in your protagonist's way over the course of the story, right? As they are trying to achieve their goal through the adventure of the story. So I think a lot of times when writers hear antagonism, their minds go to antagonists, they go to characters. And that's important. Our stories need antagonistic characters in them. Um, these are like your Voldemorts, right? Or your President Snows, or your bullies and queen bees, or the whodunits behind your mystery. You need those characters. But antagonism is actually more than just the characters, right? It can be nature. It can be storms that blow up, and the blizzard that comes down when you're trying to get through the mountain pass, or the traffic, the heavy traffic when you're trying to get to the big game. Anything that's sort of getting in the protagonist's way as they're trying to get somewhere. It can be objects like a broken down car when you need to get somewhere, or a dead cell phone battery, right? That's classic one.
Yeah.
Or it can be, the tree that falls on your car. Right? That means that now you have to spend the night in the creepy cabin or something like that. So it can be forces of nature or objects or things that they're encountering on the way that are getting in their way. And it can also be like social and cultural stereotypes, family expectations, um, anything that your protagonist is bumping up against. So it doesn't always have to be a character or a thing. It can be an idea or existing social cultural structures and family expectations as well.
Okay, so it doesn't necessarily have to be something that is conscientiously acting against the character, like you mentioned, a broken down car. That car is not, unless it's a special kind of story you're telling about a living car here. Um, the car is not purposely trying to stop the character, but it is still impeding the character. So it
Yes.
doesn't necessarily have to be done on purpose, just so long as it is in our way.
Right. Yeah. You want to be having your protagonist crash up against things that are forcing them to make choices, to make decisions, to have barriers and things that they have to get over. So you want to infuse the story with all these types of antagonism. And that's going to help you build conflict and sustain conflict on the page, which is what is going to help engage the readers in your story.
Yeah.
Without conflict, it's just a bunch of things happening to your protagonist, right? There's no story without conflicts. You've got to get that antagonism on the page.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm glad you brought up the word conflict because I was actually going to ask if you could help us distinguish what what would be different when we use the word conflict versus antagonism.
Sure. Yeah. So I think the way to think about that is that antagonism is a key driver of the conflict in the story. So um, an antagonist, when you think about it, an antagonist is trying to sort of like force compliance with something, right? They have a plan, or they have a vision, or they have a goal, or they have a certain amount of power that they want to protect. And the protagonist is resisting that that compliance, right? Because they're trying to maintain their agency and their autonomy as they try to navigate this plan that they suddenly landed in the middle of, or maybe sought out, depending on the story. So what happens? You get this power struggle between what the antagonist wants and what the protagonist wants, and in that struggle, that power struggle back and forth between these two characters, you actually drive the conflict.
Mm.
So I think it can be really helpful to think of what is the power struggle at the center of my story. And that can really help you start to define what the conflict is and help you start to define what kind of antagonists are going to help you build the conflict that you need for your story.
Right. And we can have conflict between two characters that are on the same side.
Yeah.
Like by human nature, we are all going to be in conflict at some point with others, even if we are working towards the same end goal. Whereas, like the antagonist, might be in conflict because you're working against each other. But yeah, so I can see a little distinction there as well. We mentioned the antagonist sometimes being a character. Um, is this what we mean by villain then? Is this how you categorize a villain, or is there a distinction there as well?
Yeah, so this is where I think it can be helpful again to think about antagonism at work in a story through layers, right? You have layers of antagonism. Um, and it can almost you can almost think of it as there being a sort of hierarchy at work
Mhm.
in your story, right? Um, so you can kind of, if you want to think of it as a hierarchy, you can look at the top of the hierarchy, right? And I always think of at the top of the hierarchy, we have what I like to call mastermind antagonists. And this might be where the villains fall in, right? The Lord Voldemorts and the President Snows, right? Um, the mastermind antagonists are the people with the plan, right? They're the people with the vision. And they're the ones who have the most to gain or the most to lose when the protagonist steps in and messing it up, right? But they're going to go after what they want no matter what, no matter the cost, right? This is their plan. They're on like step 17 of a 20-step plan, and then the protagonist shows up and messes everything up for them, and they've got to
Right.
scramble and try to make their vision happen, and they'll do it at any cost. Um, Masterminds aren't typically on the page very often, which makes them kind of interesting, unless you have some really big twist and a main character turns out to be your antagonist, which would be really fun, actually. But most of the time, they're not on the page very often, but their plan is what's driving that power struggle, right? They're the ones sitting at the heart of that power struggle. And like we said, masterminds are sometimes characters like President Snow and Voldemort, but sometimes they are more like social and cultural expectations and stereotypes too. So they don't have to be active characters in the story. It's a stereotype like oh, Asians are always good at math. You might have a protagonist pushing up against that, right? Or the idea that like, oh, girls don't play football or something, and you have a protagonist pushing up against that cultural expectation, right? That can also be kind of acting as a mastermind that's creating the power struggle there between the antagonist and the protagonist. And so even if you're sitting there thinking like, well, I write contemporary, I don't have a Voldemort in my story, I don't need a mastermind. You do need a mastermind. You need to figure out what that mastermind is in your story if it's not a character. Um, so, um, oh, I just had something and I lost it. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, so even if you're writing contemporary, you still need a mastermind because you need to understand what that power struggle is at the center
Yeah.
of your story.
Yeah. Okay. So since we're talking about middle grade and YA today, um, maybe let's talk a little bit about how this might look depending on the age category for which we're writing, because I think there's some obvious distinctions in terms of what is allowed in YA versus what is allowed in middle grade. And I'm guessing the writers here will already know, like, well, it can be scarier if we're if we're in the YA world, and maybe less graphic if we're in the middle grade world. But I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on how antagonism is treated if you're the writer, how to incorporate antagonism for the younger versus the older reader categories?
Yeah, I think in terms of getting antagonism on the page, it doesn't look that different, right? In terms of getting it, like you want these layers of antagonism working in both YA and middle grade. The key difference is, I think, the same difference that always differentiates middle grade from YA, which is that middle grade is about who am I in, or no, middle grade is about what is this big world that I'm living in? And YA is about who am I in this big world that I'm living in, right? So middle grade is about agency and YA is about identity. So when you're talking about antagonists in middle grade versus YA, antagonists in middle grade are going to be sort of attacking their agency. They're going to be going after their agency in middle grade. Whereas in YA, they're going to be going after their identity more. The arc of the Harry Potter books is a really good example of this. So in those earlier books that are more middle grade, he's landed in this wizarding world. He's trying to figure this world out. He's making allies and enemies, right? And Voldemort's attacks are attacking his agency in this world. But as the books go on, and they transition into more of a YA story, Harry he's figured out this world that he's living in. Now he's trying to figure out, well, who am I in this wizarding world? Who do I want to be? How am I going to act? How am I going to push back against Voldemort? So now he's wrestling with questions of identity, not just agency. And Voldemort is attacking his very identity, right? I mean, he has
Mm.
part of Voldemort in him, right? He could give in to that hate and that anger. Those later books get kind of dark, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But he doesn't, because the arc of the whole story has taught him that hate isn't the answer, love is. Um, but looking at that can give you a really good example of how antagonism can change from middle grade to YA. It's not quite so personal or all about Harry in those early ones. It's about that his world and his agency and his ability to move around in that world. And later, it really is about who he is as a person. So that is your key difference, I think, between middle grade and YA.
Well, super interesting and succinctly stated. I like that.
Thank you.
So, okay. So for writers who I think sometimes we hear the feedback of like the story might be not all that interesting, or maybe it's falling a bit flat. These might be comments that a writer might hear if there is not enough antagonism, enough conflict
Yeah.
on the page. So, what kind of strategies or tips do you like to incorporate with the writers that you work with to help strengthen these aspects of their stories?
Yeah. Well, again, I go back to this idea that there are layers of antagonism. It's not a one and done thing. You don't just figure out that mastermind. Underneath that mastermind, you have what I like to call like his henchmen, right? The people who are out and about in the world executing that mastermind's plan. Um, because the mastermind is often off stage when you're writing the story. The henchmen are the people that the protagonists are bumping up against in the story. So if you are struggling with conflict in your story, look at your story. Do you have a mastermind? And then do you have people out there executing that mastermind's plan and getting in the protagonist's way? Um, and then you can, and again, as you mentioned too, like a third layer of antagonism is that those allies with a challenge, right? Those allies who are pushing back, that step into that role of antagonism from time to time to push against the protagonist and say, hey, have you thought this through? Like, I don't think this is, I don't think you're ready for this yet, right? It's like Obi-Wan Kenobi pushing back on Luke and saying, like, revenge is not the way, right? If you pick revenge, you're just going to end up like Darth Vader. So those antagonists are really important to the story because those are a protagonist is more likely to listen to an ally pushing
Yeah,
back against them. And so those can be really important moments in your story that help push your character along their arc of change, just like Obi-Wan Kenobi pushes Luke on that arc of change away from wanting revenge to realizing revenge isn't the answer. So again, if you're trying to build these layers of antagonism into your story, do you have allies with a challenge stepping in at a key moment and pushing back against your protagonist, which is helping them have to sort of stand back and reassess and then maybe move forward on their internal arc of change. And then on like a scene to scene level, you can play around with the antagonistic forces, right? This is the weather, the traffic, whatever is getting in the way at this very moment, right? It might not be some
Yeah.
big global challenge that they have to overcome, but um, if you don't have every scene should have some type of antagonism in that there should be something that the protagonist is trying to solve or to get through or get past or get over. And so they don't all have to be big scenes with masterminds or henchmen, but if you have a scene where nothing, it's really flat and nothing's really happening, maybe it's time for an allies with a challenge, or it's time for an antagonistic force, something that's gonna bring some more tension and conflict to the page and force your character to take action on something.
Yeah. How do you how do you suggest writers avoid falling in the trap of making something melodramatic for the sake of just adding more conflict?
Mm, yeah. Well, the conflict should be tied um, to the character's journey, right? So you
Mm,
don't want to just throw the kitchen sink at
yeah.
the manuscript. You want to think about what types of conflict are going to matter to the story. Um, and so that will just require a little bit of thinking on your part to make sure that you aren't just creating conflict for
Yeah.
conflict's sake, but that this conflict matters to the story. It's pushing, right? The conflict has some kind of consequence that's pushing the story forward. If you're throwing conflicts at the protagonist and there's no consequences to these problems, then you've got conflict for conflict's sake, and it's not helping your story. It's probably going to weigh it down and slow it down. So make sure
Mm,
that it's bringing consequences to the page that the protagonist has to deal with, right? And it might even drive that next choice decision that they have to make.
yeah, I love you pointing out that too much could really slow it down because I think that we often put conflict in the category of um, at least for me, it feels like when there's conflict, the pacing feels quicker to me. But if you have too much, then as you're saying, you're like trying to get yourself through the weeds to get through out of the swamp, so to speak. No, I think that's really good advice. So I know that you have done just a ton of research on this particular topic, and the writers here now have probably seen this as well. Um, do you have any kind of special resources for writers to sort of help with this particular topic? Because it is just so important in writing fiction,
Yeah.
period.
It is. It's so important. And I think it does sometimes get short shrift as we focus in so much on our protagonist
Yeah,
story, right? And which is understandable. We're not telling the antagonist story, we're telling the protagonist story. But the more work we do to build up our antagonism and make sure that it's not vague, right? That we understand what our antagonists are up to and what's at stake for them and what their goals are, that automatically makes your protagonist shine more, right? Because if your
yeah,
protagonist has something clear that they're working against, then they just look better and they read better on the page. But if everything's sort of vague, then readers have a hard time understanding like what's at stake here, and then they have a hard time engaging with that story. So
yeah.
I do have a resource for writers if they're interested in it. I call it Conflict Generator. And it steps you through the different layers of antagonism and helps you figure out, do I have these different layers of antagonism at work in my story, or do I have a lot more work to do to figure out what is creating conflict in my story? So you can go to my website and download that.
I love that. I'm gonna have to download that myself. I feel like too for writers who might be a little like me, I tend to want to avoid conflict in real life. right? And that can make it sometimes challenging to make sure that it's in your story because you're like, I want to just
Yes.
avoid conflict, but without conflict, without antagonism, there's no reason to read.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. One of the most important things that you can do as you are developing and drafting a story is figuring out where does that power struggle lie? What is my character struggling against? And it can be a person, a person with a plan who is that they end up getting tangled up with. It can be something more um, social cultural that they're pushing up against, but you've got to understand what that power struggle is. Another example, I'm just going to throw out one more example because this is a good one for contemporary writers, because this contemporary is the hardest where to figure out how to get antagonism. It really is. Because it's easy in something like, Harry Potter or the Hunger Games, like when the stakes are life and death, right? It's easy to figure out how, like, where antagonism comes into play in the story. And contemporary can be a little bit harder, but there's a book, Pieces of Me by Renee Watson. This is a really beautiful book. It's about Jade, she's the protagonist, and she grows up in a poor Black neighborhood. And she's tired of that defining her. She feels like everybody looks at her as somebody to fix, someone to help. And they don't see her as a whole person. And so she's using her art to develop her own voice and her own vision and to push back against the stereotype that poor Black girls need fixing, right? The power struggle that she's engaged with is that stereotype, this vision,
Mhm.
right? That poor Black girls need to be fixed, and she's using art to push back against that. So if you're working contemporary and you're really struggling with, like, I don't know how to get antagonism on the page, see if you can keep digging till you find that power struggle, that thing that your character is just crashing up against again and again in the story. And almost envision it like it's a character, right? Step into it and imagine what it looks like, what the protagonist looks like from that point of view, right? If you are a cultural stereotype and someone's pushing up against you, what does that look like, right? That's threatening to you, that's destabilizing to you, right? So if you are writing contemporary and you're like, I don't know how to figure this out, look for the power struggle, right? That
Yeah.
is the heart of your story. And almost think of it like a character, right? And try to get inside its head and understand what the protagonist looks like through its eyes.
Mm, very cool. Okay, so I want to make sure that people know how to find you. How can we find you?
Yes, well, the best way to find me is my website, which is erinhalden.com. So that's easy. You can also find me on Instagram is usually where I hang out. So yeah, those are the two best places to find me.
Awesome. And writers, you will definitely want to find Erin. She is super savvy, super smart, and I've had the privilege to work with her as well. So I can say this with certainty and confidence. She knows what she's talking about. So I hope that writers will find you and definitely check out this conflict generator. And Erin, I just want to thank you so much for this really interesting conversation about a very, very important topic.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. It was fun.
All right, writers, thanks for joining us, and we will catch you next time. Bye.